We are now kicking off the second part of the recording with Ran Eisenberg around feature flags, and in this part we are specifically going to look at a lifecycle for feature flags and also some source code that we are actually going to share with you as well later on how do you deal with feature flags, how you set them up, how do you actually manage them within your sources. So stay tuned and let me know what you think.
Let's do it.
What do you want to start with?
Okay, so I think the life cycle, it goes like this, right? You need to understand, hey, do I need a feature flag for this specific feature? And when should I do and when should I not?
Mm-hmm.
And I think my guideline for that is, first of all, if it's a major feature and it's something that's going to have a lot of impact, or it's something that you want to have A/B testing, or it's very complicated, or it's very simple, like it's easy to encapsulate it in some area of the code. It's not like different changes all over the code, like we saw here, right? It's very easy to contain it, to have one function to handle this new logic that does something and whatever. Then it's a classic case for configuration and for feature flags. So once you understand that, you can go ahead and decide on the implementation and write the code and write the configuration in the app.config JSON file.
Mm-hmm.
And then you need to write tests. And if you don't mind, we can go and show some tests that I've prepared for this example. Yes. Okay, so it's under integration. I call it integration because I actually trigger the Lambda handler locally with a generated event, but I run with the permissions of my user, and I can actually call app.config and I call DynamoDB that I use here. But in this instance, I'm going to make two kinds of tests. I'm going to test, let's take a look at the campaign, right? I want to test the feature flag for the campaign when it's on and when it's off. When it's on, I want to test that my new function, right, the handle campaign function, that it actually gets run. That's what I do here. I use Mocker Spy, which is a nice feature from PyTest, that I let the function run as it is, but in the end I can know some statistics about it. So I can know that it's actually ran, right? Call count equals 1. And I will see if you had side effects or changes to the database or whatever, you put them in this test. This is the test that everybody does. We want to check that the feature works, right?
Yeah, of course.
Easy. Now, this is the test that I think many people forget about, but it's really critical. We actually had a bug in production because we forgot to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I want to test that when the campaign is off, the new logic does not run.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes the if feature then do the new behavior is not that simple. Sometimes it's a more complicated if. It has numerous other dependencies, whatever, and you might have a bug there, right? So you might have an issue there.
Mm-hmm.
And you assume that your flag is off because, hey, it's off. It's not in production. The JSON file is off, but you have a bug in your if statement, and then the code still runs, and it actually happened to us. So this test makes sure that the new logic does not run, right? Call count equals 0. It does not get run at all. And this allows you to make sure that when the feature flag is off in my configuration, it's off. Now, how do I mock the configuration? I don't really call app.config and change the configuration on the fly here. I mock the calls to app.config, and I use a mocked JSON file to return back to the power tools. So in one case, 10% off campaign is false. And in another campaign, the other part where it's the mocked campaign is on, the default value is on, because that's what I want to test. And this way I can test it in whatever environment I have, no matter what's the actual deployment, right? Because this, I'm going to run this on my dev account. The actual value that I deployed is going to be true at some point, right? I'm going to advance the feature flag, dev, test, whatever. In production, it's going to be false until I decide that the feature is stable enough in integration environments, and we did testing or whatever. But I want the test still to run and to be consistent no matter what I do on my environment, right? Because I'm going to run these tests on dev test and test integration. I want this test to be consistent. So that's why I'm using the mocked schemas. And this is the way you can do it.
Yeah, and the mocks to the app config, how do you mock them out at the end?
Yeah, so I have this function. I'm using the PyTest mocker, and I'm just telling it, hey, go to this magical PowerTools function. I think it's from the documentation, by the way, from PowerTools documentation. And I tell it, please replace this function. And when somebody calls this function, the return value that it will get return you is this. So it doesn't really go to app config. It just returns the JSON value that I provided in the input here, the mock schema dictionary, whatever.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Super simple. Yeah. So now that you have your tests, you can start enabling it in different accounts like dev, test, integration. Yeah, run your testing, integration test, enable it, see that it's working great, that the UI is working great with it, whatever you need to do. Then you decide to go to production. And in production, I suggest you use the canary deployment variation and just enable, you basically deploy the new configuration for production. By the way, I'm not sure that I've mentioned it, but this is the JSON configuration. And usually per environment, you'd have different JSON files. That's why it's called dev configuration. So you enable the different files, and then you get to the production configuration JSON. You enable the default campaign here to be true. It's going to be false by default, or it's not going to be even there in the code. And then you should have in your CDK code for production to use a different deployment strategy. Use canary deployment and define the CloudWatch alarm so you have automatic rollback in case something wrong happens, right? It can happen. Maybe you've missed
it always
some
can,
test or use case, whatever. And when it happens, no worries, right? You're going to have automatic rollback. You're going to add more tests. You're going to do a retro meeting, understand what happened, how you missed it, whatever. If not, and the feature is up and running, then you go to the monitor stage, right? You're going to monitor that it continues to work is fine. If there's an issue like 2 days later, something happens, you can go ahead and disable it immediately and run the pipeline. You change it to false, run the pipeline and change it immediately as soon as possible. And then you need to go back into the CI/CD stages, understand why did I miss it, add tests and things like that, and then go back again to deploy it to production. It's like a cycle.
With monitoring, what do you mean? Do you mean looking at the application, looking at the evaluations of the app config, looking at the behavior or the log files?
Okay, so once the deployment is over, right, the canary deployment is over, app config has finished its part, right? The configuration, you defined it like wait for 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, do canary deployment, whatever. 2 days later, something happens, it's up to you. You might have CloudWatch alarms, Lambda errors, whatever. You need to make sure that you have proper observability monitors, PagerDuty integrations, whatever you need to do to understand that you had a fault in somewhere in the code. Somebody needs to go and understand that this feature, this is the problem. And the safest thing to do, the easiest thing to do is basically just disable the feature, then look at the logs, understand what happened, add more tests, and then again go up the stages, different accounts, all the way to production again.
Do you know if app config has an integration with X-Ray or something like that, as like I would be able to kind of trace down whether the problems that I'm facing are related to a specific feature value or config value?
Not at the moment. I think that there's you have AWS CloudWatch evidently, which is it's very similar, but it's different. They provide more analytics about the feature flags, so perhaps you can do that there. I'm hoping for more cooperation and to have these capabilities get into app config in the future. So at the moment, no, but who knows?
So it
yeah.
sounds so. Just listening to you and have not really looked at app config myself, right?
Mhm.
It looks a little bit like, okay, now in Pinpoint I can run a campaign, I can try to do things, and then I will see how it actually works. And app config could be something that I could use for kind of the same feature at the end, right? If I use dynamic feature flagging, I could be turning on things, then see now Ran clicks on the button 5 times more than before, and Johannes clicks on it 10 times less than before. So we might have 2 user profiles or stuff like that, right? And I was just trying to understand whether app config has these analytics capabilities today or not.
No. So what I would do, I'd used Power Tools metrics utility, and actually it's a one-liner. I think I have an example for that somewhere here. Yeah. So you have this metrics utility that allows you to add custom CloudWatch metrics.
Mm-hmm.
So you can add in one line. I can take this, right, and I can go here and just say, okay, so I've enabled a premium user, so I'm gonna add like a premium event,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm premium event, and then I can add like add +1 to premium event getting a call, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's up to me. It's not out of the box yet, and I do hope that they will add these cool analytics in the future.
Okay, cool. Thank you for going into that. Now we have the feature flag, we have introduced it, and we were able to bring it to all of our environments and to test it there, and it worked perfectly fine, right? And from a lifecycle perspective, now we are in production for 1 week, 2 weeks, depending on how long I want to run this as an experiment, right? And now the boss tells us, okay, this is gonna stay forever. Now, well, we can just leave things like they are, right? We don't need to change anything. It just runs, correct?
Yeah, just works. Yeah.
That's not what
but
you
you
would
shouldn't.
do. Yeah, why not?
You shouldn't. Because I mean, look at the code, right? It adds complexity. You need to fetch it, right? I mean, the fetch is just once, but you have this code where you could just have this line. Mm-hmm. Just do whatever you need to do. Just call it directly or do it here. So you have this added complexity here that you need to test. And we have our tests. We have all these tests for when it's on, when it's off. Maybe you have even more configurations like matrices, whatever. It's going to get more complicated to test. And you also have the JSON file. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's going to get more complicated to understand what's going on in different environments, right? So why not? If the feature is stable and been stable for quite a while, and you don't expect more code changes in that area, right? You have different features in other areas, and you can basically just say, okay, it's been like a month. Customers are happy with it. I don't expect any new features. I don't have bugs around that. Let's remove the flag. We're good. We're golden, right? Let's make our code simpler. Why not?
But that brings up the thing like, what if something happens with that feature? I can never turn it off again.
Yeah, that's a risk you're gonna take. I mean, but you did have like a solid month around it, so it really depends on how much. Well, you can make sure that it has run, right? You can add metrics. You can make sure that people are using it quite a lot. You can get feedback from customers. I mean, it's a balance, right? I mean, if you want to be always on the safe side or have like easier code to maintain, it's a balance.
And I think it's also a decision point, because at the end, the product manager, product owner, however you organize your product, can take the decision, okay, this is now a feature I really want to take into my main feature set, right? But at the same time, in that very moment, you can also decide, okay, no one is using it, so let's throw it away, right? That is also an option.
That's actually a really good point, because it allows you to really understand if you're wasting your time, right? If you're developing a feature that nobody really wants, and maybe the product team made a mistake. So you can add this metric and this feature flag and really understand whether it's really important to continue and expand this feature or not. That's really a good point.
Yeah, so that's where I think that removing a feature flag gives you that decision point in that kind of need within your software lifecycle to take a decision, right? And then after that, you kind of need to full-blownly support that feature if you take away that feature flag, because there is no easy way out, right? At the end.
Yeah.
So can we look at how that process would look like? So how would you discontinue a feature flag? Is it just deleting the lines of code?
Well, basically, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't touch the configuration. I wouldn't. That's the last thing that I would do, because we still have in production services that read this configuration. So I'd go ahead and just remove this part, and just leave the handle campaign part, and then go to the tests and remove them, deploy that, make sure that everything is okay, and then you can go ahead and remove, and then you can go ahead and remove this configuration, because it can still be there, but nobody's going to read it, so it's still okay.
So if I remove the part of the code, then I would now expect one of the tests failing. I think that's obvious, right? Okay, cool. And then once I remove that test that failed, I would still leave that one test in the test that the campaign is active, or would you remove that as well?
Yeah. That's my bad. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you need to make sure that this part is working, but you obviously don't need to mock the schema campaign. Just make sure that it runs and works properly.
So you would
just all the responses are okay or whatever.
So we would need to update that function that tests that the feature is active. We would need to change that to not rely on the feature flag anymore, but we would still keep that test in, right? On the other side, the other test, that tests that the campaign is off.
Just remove it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, and then last but not least, you would be updating the configuration.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds logical, right? That's how I would do it.
I hope so.
Yeah, it is. Now, I think that's the stuff that we wanted to actually share, right? That's the things that we wanted to look at. How do I maybe one step back to app config? If I discontinue feature flags, is there a possibility to verify that now Johannes has removed this feature flag? So is there a history somehow that I can show that?
That's an amazing question. Yes, you have versions. So I think my user doesn't have permissions to whatever. There are versions, and you can explore the different versions that you had and see what were. There's a history here, basically. So yeah.
Okay.
And so also you have your own Git history. So you have like different. You have history on AWS, and you have history on your Git history, which is, I mean, it's there. It's not really ideal or easy to look at, but you have different PRs, right? Because we are doing PRs to change them, so you can go and look at the different changes that you had, or just look at the versions, which is easier.
Okay, so app config would be showing us the application with a changed version of the configuration here, but this is not related to one specific feature flag. This is related to the overall application configuration that we see over here. Okay.
Okay. Like every change to configuration is a different version, so it doesn't show. I mean, I'm using here like it's called a freeform JSON configurations because it allows you the most flexibility to do whatever I want, and that's what I needed for the SDK for feature flags. They do have regular feature flags, but at the moment I still find the freeform and the app config, the feature flags for Power Tools still to be more flexible and more powerful at the moment. But who knows, that might change in the future.
Cool. Yeah. So, but I think I understood what I wanted to understand, which is where do I see the version of the feature flags, or which ones are activated or which ones are being used, and this kind of stuff, right? I would be able to compare that here as well if I see the compare button in the UI as well, and I think that is also pretty powerful then.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it is in the context of always an account, right? You can see all the accounts together and understand, oh, okay, in dev, I have this feature enabled, but in production, it's disabled. You can see it in the JSON files in your repository, but you can't really see it here in the console. The console is always in the context of one account.
Cool.
So that's a limitation.
Yeah, that makes sense. So no cross-account access for feature app config.
You could do that. I'm actually writing an article about it. I mean, you could do that. You need to facilitate it yourself. Like if you want to have one configuration, the two accounts access it, you need to provide the different roles for, for the access, for accessing different accounts. But you can do it, but you need to do it yourself. It's not built in somehow.
Okay, cool. Now let's go a little bit into the CI/CD pipeline for that pieces, because you kind of mentioned at the end it's just it should be just a different pipeline. I don't know if you're prepared to share something or to show something around that. If not, we can just talk through it.
I'm gonna go with it.
Okay, so my what I'm interested in at the end is really, well, okay, cool. We would need to have two different pipelines, and the reason, the question is why, right? So why do you think we should not have everything in one pipeline, which is something that you said at the beginning?
Yeah, well, this example, it is in the same pipeline because, like I said, it's an example for a template. I wanted to keep it simple. Because that means that when you have a problem, right, not in the Canary deployment area, like 2 days later after the feature is live and you want to make a quick change, you want to revert it, you'll need to go through all this pipeline. I have lots of tests here and end-to-end tests, integrations, whatever, and it's going to take more time. And all you want to do is basically flip a switch, right? And you want to be as quickly as possible because your production is having problems at the moment, right? So if you have it in the same part, it's going to take more time. If you have different pipelines, then you could run just the pipeline to upload the JSON file. It's very quick, right? It really depends on our deployment strategy, but it can be like go ahead and 0 to 100 in a second, right? So it really depends on what you want to do. So static configuration, it's going to take more time. Dynamic, separate into a different pipeline.
Okay, so let's stick to that dynamic approach, right? How would we achieve that? It sounds like...
Yeah, so you'd create a different repository and move the configuration. You'd create a new stack in CDK. This is the stack that I have. A stack basically translates to CloudFormation file. And here you can see I have two parts. I have the configuration store and I have my API, my service, right? So you would need to make another repository, different repository, and just have this part here, right? You can even clone this part, this entire repository, delete this, and just deploy this part. And then you would have your own separate pipeline. And what it does, it's a GitHub Actions part.
I would want to add one more thought. Okay. It would not need to be a different repository per se. It would need to be a different CDK app that you would be deploying at the end, right? So there's no need to have a separate repository, or is there?
I think it's best to have. It really depends on the personas. There's a lot of discussions around CDK best practices. I think that having one stack, one application is preferred, but you can basically do whatever you want and like mix it up, but then the pipelines would need to be different and to be triggered by I mean, if I make the changes to the configurations, I don't want my service to get triggered, and it's easier to do that when you have a different repository, but I mean, you could get it working.
Okay, so it's just really like more. So from my perspective, it sometimes is easier to have one team managing one repository instead of one team managing multiple repositories, which is why I was just trying to say, well, it is possible to do that in one repo as well. You just need to then, as you just mentioned, right, make sure that specific workflows are only executed based on the path of the commit at the end, right?
Yeah, I mean, it has pluses and minuses, because then you need, if you have multiple repositories, you have perfect separation, right? It's really easy to make changes in either service separately, and they have like an agreed API or whatever. Like, but you need to make sure that you can share the resource names between them. So it's either
Mm-hmm.
you have different mechanisms to do that, either via SSM in during the one repository publishes via Cloud Map or SSM all the parameters that you need to get, or it's just some hard-coded values that you are never going to change because it's the same team, so maybe it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It makes things more complicated, especially when you have like a database that you need to expose in another stack, and then you need all the ports or name or domain, whatever. But it has its pluses.
So what would we do in that configuration pipeline?
Yeah.
We don't need any testing, I would say, right?
Yeah. I mean, I did add some tests to the configuration to make sure that you're loading a proper JSON configuration that matches the PowerTools schema. We have validations in the PowerTools that are run in the Lambda side when it loads it, and I don't want to to fail at the Lambda stage. I want to fail before I upload it. So I added custom validations to the code that uploads the configuration. It parses the dev configuration JSON file and makes sure that it's the correct schema, and you can get it for free if you take this code. But also AppConfig has support for validations. So you can add your own custom validations and make sure that AppConfig runs those validations for you instead of writing them in the code. But I think in the code is basic. It's pretty much okay. I'm running the pipeline, so I don't mind to do that in the code. It's easier for me. So what it does is just sets up the machine. I'm using Python 3.10. I need Node for CDK. We're using CDK to deploy. And what I do here is basically set up my environment, install CDK, install Poetry, all the tools that I'm using. And I have dev dependencies like PyTest and other tools like Flake and whatever. And Lambda, that's the PowerTools and Pydantic and other utilities that are actually zipped with the Lambda and uploaded to AWS. I configure my AWS credentials. I have an OADC application in AWS in my AWS account. It assumes a role in my account safely and does whatever it needs to do. It took me a while to figure this out. I needed to create an organization in my account, but I got it working. The documentation was okay. It's better than having like an access key and a secret access key here, like hard-coded. Don't do that. It's a bad security practice. So this is the way to do it. It's the recommended way to do it. Then I run all the linters, complexity checks, whatever, unit tests, things like that. And then you have the deployment to AWS. I have a makefile that, as you can see, I have a makefile that abstracts all the commands that I can also run locally. And what it does in a nutshell is basically runs CDK. So if I go to the makefile and look at the deploy, it does, this will create the zip files and whatever I need and put it in the .build repository. And then CDK can take those zip files, these folders, and zip them and upload them to AWS. So this is basically the command, the regular CDK command that we all use. Nothing special about that. And that's it pretty much for the use case of feature flags. I mean, I have like tests and whatever, but it's not really relevant for feature flags. You need to deploy, and that's it.
Yeah, maybe it would be easier for people consuming the repository to have an inactive workflow that would exactly match that scope, right?
Yeah,
that might be something that you could add here. But I think I get the idea. The pipeline
would a good idea.
Would be faster at the end because you don't have all of those testing over there. You maybe also have less unit tests or validation tests that you have in the application pipeline as a whole, right?
And the resources that you have, just very small resources, right? You don't have all the service and the databases and things like that. You don't really you don't go over these Lambda functions, layers, and whatever. Just very simple app config resources.
Cool, thanks. So let's stop sharing the screen and go back to kind of a wrap up for our session today. And looking on the time, I believe that we're going to need to do 2 sessions out of this one. So if you could stop sharing your screen, we can go into my... Not yet. Not yet. You paused. You need to stop. We're going to figure that out. Somehow. Yay, that worked.
Did it.
Yeah, we did it. Awesome. We did it again, and it was amazing again. Maybe let's summarize on why do you think that feature flags are an important mechanism for major DevOps tools or major DevOps teams that build a, I would say, production-ready application?
Basically, it just improves your feature quality and makes sure that you're able to revert in case of problems quickly, whether it's during the first initial phase of deployment or afterwards, like 2 days, 3 days, a month later. And it also allows you to do A/B testing, which is a very important capability, like we saw with the premium user or whatnot. So basically, just a whole world of excellent features. So why not?
Yep, that makes sense. And I cannot agree more. But as you said, I think it's really it's a mature practice, right? So it really requires your team to already have a strategy on doing deployments, and you also need to have an application, because a feature flag for an application that does not have any features is not really meaningful.
Yeah.
What do you think about app config? So we looked at app config being one of the specific services that can help you perform feature flagging. There is tons of services outside. What do you think is the main benefit of app config?
So I think that the fact that it's in AWS and you don't need to really integrate anything externally, the pricing is okay, and it's FedRAMP High compliant, and you've got Canary deployments. I think the automatic rollback capability, the integration with CloudWatch, is something that I haven't seen in any other third party. Like I've seen it's possible to do it in other services. It's not that easy as just giving it an ARN of the CloudWatch alarm and just, hey, this is the alarm, go for it. So because it's AWS and because it's self-managed, it's really easy to use. It's not perfect. I'm not gonna lie. I do talk with the team and ask for more features as always, but it's pretty great, and we're using it in production.
Cool, good to know, and thank you so much, as I personally have not had a look on it. Ran, I know you and I follow you everywhere at the end, but maybe others don't. So what is the newest project that you have been launching in the last days?
So actually, yesterday I've published a new repository. It's called the AWS Lambda Env Modeler, and it's just a best practice for parsing and validating Lambda environment variables in Python with Pydantic. It's something that I've been doing for a long time. It was on my, it was a hard-coded code on my template. I've written blogs about it, like best practices for environment variables. Basically, it's like static configuration, right? Environment variables. And it allows you to make sure that when the Lambda is run, it has the proper configuration, everything is defined as it is, type constraints and value constraints. You can have like HTTP URL environment variables, and you can make sure that it is a valid HTTP URL. And you have a global getter that you can get the environment variables from whatever you want in the code. So you're always safe that if you're going to use an environment variable, it's there. You don't have like crashes inside your code like you have. Usually people do like os.get environment variable and the parameter. Oops, it doesn't exist. And oops, my test didn't, test this specific part of the code and I have a crash. Bummer. So it's not going to happen when you test everything at the beginning of the handler. And I think it also provides visibility to really understand what are the environment variables that you have, because people like to add like more variables and they copy paste from other Lambdas. are we using them? Are we not? Well, it allows you to really drill down and understand what's really important, because if it's not part, if you're going to remove one and then your code doesn't crash, it means that you're not really using it. So that's basically it.
Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic project to look at as well. I assume it's going to be Python as well.
Yeah, it is. It
okay.
is. It's yeah.
I don't like Python too much, but I'm learning every day, Ran. So I'm going to
Join
make
the
sure.
dark side.
I'm going to ensure that I will add the link to the show note as well, because I think it is a cool project to look at. And I'm also going to market one of the other sessions that you recently did in June. I think you were on Gunnar Gross show around SaaS. And presented a tenant onboarding process that you run at CyberArk. And that was pretty amazing. So thanks again for sharing your knowledge, sharing your learning experiences, and for being with me on the show again today. And yeah, talk to you soon.
Thanks, man.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.